You're listening to the Myanmar Elections Briefing. Today is Sunday, the 8th of November, the day that we've all been anxiously waiting for. It's the day of the Myanmar 2020 General Elections.
This is our third and final episode of a three-part podcast series where we will take you through things you need to know in the lead up to the Myanmar elections.
My name is Bernard Min.
And I'm Wei Crystal Kine.
And we are your hosts on this podcast.
In today's podcast, we'll be taking a forward-looking approach. Regardless who wins in the polls today, there are key priorities that need to be undertaken. We are coming out of decades of military rule and are in the nascent stages of nation building. This means that the foundations we lay now are going to be critical for our country's growth and development.
So first off, we'll be sharing some background on the challenges in policymaking, public administration, and institutions. In this segment, our Chief Research Officer and co-producer of this podcast, Myat Mon, will be sharing some barriers to overcome and some things to focus on going forward for building institutional capacity in Myanmar's government.
We then have a special guest, Cho Zin Thet, in Myanmar to share with us the role of think tanks and some of the challenges faced in Myanmar. Cho Zin will also be sharing some perspectives on how we're progressing with federalism and decentralization in Myanmar. Again, it's important to note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are of the speakers alone and do not represent the views and opinions of the organizations that we may be affiliated with.
So let's get started with the things you need to know in this year's Myanmar General Elections. As a nascent democracy, a pressing challenge for the Myanmar government, regardless of who's going to win today's election, their challenge is going to be about how to transform institutions to effectively develop, implement, and review policy reforms. Because for almost 6 decades, since the military coup d'etat in 1962, Burma, as it was known back then, was governed by a heavily centralized military government in which policy priorities were largely determined by a handful of powerful military officials. So this top-down command policy was pervasive across national and subnational government levels.
So in the last 10 years, there has been a radical shift as soon as we embarked on a political transition towards democracy. So this means that there was now increased civic space for accountability, a relationship between the state and its citizens, as well as the question of service delivery and the capacity of the administration and the government to deliver. So just very briefly, in U Thein Sein's government, a semi-civilian government, they adopted a new 2008 constitution, and this really laid the foundation for a new administrative and governing structure and institutions. Now, the 2008 constitution describes or tries to clarify the formal institutional arrangements and the division of responsibilities and powers between the central union government and the newly established state and regional governments. Now, there was widespread recognition that subnational governance and central-local relations are critical for the future of Myanmar, and that these very institutions and relations were undergoing rapid and significant change. And with the NLD win in 2015, our very first and free and fair elections after decades of military rule, there was hope for genuine change. A democratically elected government who was for the people and with the people, who understood and was responsive to the needs of the people.
Despite the move forward, the political reforms also introduced numerous new stakeholders at the national and subnational government levels, and these stakeholders were largely unfamiliar with policymaking and government administration. So now, to make matters a bit more difficult here, the new government also inherited substandard practices from the previous government, which would have included things like a lack of a policymaking process to guide policy development, implementation, and review. Also, highly centralized, highly concentrated levels of policymaking at the very top levels of government, with limited involvement of other relevant stakeholders. And lastly, lack of data and evidence used to drive policy priorities.
As we head into the next term, it is critical that whichever government wins the elections, they are able to inspire confidence through tangible policy reform that demonstrate its ability to deliver on priorities, understand the sentiments of the people, and meet the public's needs. Prolonged failure to do so will only instigate disenchantment, which we're already kind of seeing in ethnic minority groups and in certain large cities in the lead up to today's elections.
So the key question here is, how do we get there? How can the Myanmar government inspire that confidence and implement tangible policy reforms? A lot of it boils down to capability and capacity of the Myanmar government in terms of its administrations and its institutions. And it's not necessarily a matter of funding here that's the issue. Because since the start of the major political reforms we've had in 2011, there's been an influx of donor funding and technical assistance and a proliferation of international development organizations in the country. But then translating these inputs into strengthened national institutional capacity and capability, that can take time. However, just because it takes time doesn't mean that institutional capacity will build itself. We're joined by Myat Mon, our co-producer and our chief researcher for this podcast. Myat, can you share some light on the barriers to building institutional capacity in the Myanmar government?
There's a lot, Bernard, but when doing some research, there was one article that explained it quite well in terms of the DNA of the Myanmar government. Okay, what the article explained is that how LND party, which has been the ruling party over the last 5 years, and then they were born out of the resistance to the authoritarian rule, as you know, Bernard. And there's a certain mentality where they are careful of who they can trust, especially anyone that is connected with the former government, right? As a result, what happened was that loyalty is favored over technical capability. So in this way, the decision-making was done in a very close circle of trusted people.
Right. So I suppose with that kind of modus operandi, you're going to have this risk of less meritocracy and perhaps even more hierarchy or centralized policy decision-making. So I guess I want to ask, what are some of the things that need to be worked on going forward for whichever party leads our country in the next term?
There are a few things, Bernard. First, democratizing the party structure. The party should also make meritocracy as a fundamental way to promote within the party rather than relying predominantly on loyalty within the party. Secondly, recruiting new potential young members and leaders that have leadership quality and technical capability. I feel quite encouraged that Myanmar has a youth population that is increasingly interested in the policy direction of the country. Tactically as well, the Myanmar government should be actively looking for young people from Myanmar studying abroad or working abroad. These people have gained valuable knowledge and experience that can contribute to Myanmar. Also, the Myanmar government can continue to work on growing our passionate young leader in Myanmar as well. Look at what Indonesia and Singapore government has done. Indonesia government and President Jokowi actively look for those studying and living outside Indonesia and keep those people as expert staff in the presidential office and other key ministerial offices. Also, the father of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, has also made programs and helped many young leaders from Singapore to go study abroad to learn about how Singapore government could do things better.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that, Myat. But I'd also like to add that the mode of engagement and integration of these new recruits from abroad, that will be important because it's critical that these new recruits are well integrated into the existing civil service.
You are exactly right, Bernard. My last point here is continue investing in trainings and developing a culture of evidence-based policy making within the party itself and within the government institutions.
Thank you very much for sharing those insights, Myat. That's actually a really good segue for our next conversation with our guest speaker, Cho Zin Thet, and she will be sharing some of the developments and challenges of think tanks in Myanmar, as well as a discussion into the progress with decentralization and federalism in Myanmar.
We are joined today by Cho Zin Thet, who is an alumni of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and is currently working at a think tank in Myanmar.
Thank you for having me here, Crystal.
Thank you for joining us. So we'd like to start off by asking you a very simple question, right? Which is, what role have think tanks played in Myanmar, especially in the last 10 years?
In my opinion, over the past few years, think tanks in Myanmar are gradually playing in evidence-based research, advocacy, and capacity building roles. Many think tanks, which are also called as policy research institutes, establish evidence-based knowledge on various policy issues from service delivery to economic growth to constitutional reform to peace building. Generally, we can see there are two types of think tanks in Myanmar. First is governmental think tank, which are formed under the USDP and NLD government, and they usually advise the policymakers on specific issues based on their expertise and knowledge. And another type is non-governmental think tank, which take the position of independent and non-partisan roles, and they are more proximity to public and media through working with civil society organizations.
So I believe under the USDP, U Thein Sein's government, there was the establishment of MDRI, the Myanmar Development and Research Institute. And then under the NLD government, there's the establishment of the Myanmar Development Institute. These are the government think tanks that you were referring to. So these think tanks are established and they are there for a reason. But how influential have they been, or were they able to influence in terms of policy development in Myanmar at all?
According to the Asia Foundation study in 2016, the report has highlighted that many think tanks are taking efforts to support better policymaking are at a very early stage. So especially senior policymakers such as minister, deputy minister, or presidential advisor access policy advice from individual experts or policy research institutions, especially from governmental think tanks, by using evidence and information for their policy decisions. But I find there are still remaining challenges for policy institutes. For example, there is still a gap between information demand from policymakers and knowledge supply from policy institutions. In terms of demand side, for instance, policymaking has remained concentrated at the top with the president, including the president office and advisors, and informally with senior military leaders. And policymakers tend to have limited experience of commissioning or using evidence. So the concept of using evidence-informed approach in policy making is still relatively new in Myanmar. And our recently published study by Institute for Strategy and Policy Myanmar has shown that policymakers, especially legislators, face a variety of internal constraints, such as accessibility, capability, and party federal constraints. So this is also due to the distrust between the government and civil society after years of military authoritarianism, as well as by the lack of forums for policy discussion. And on the other side, knowledge supply is still constrained by limited available research skills and also availability of data and information. So new institutes tend to prioritize training and networking over research.
It seems very easy to say evidence-based or evidence-informed policymaking, but in practice, it's actually quite difficult, just the factors that you outlined earlier. So according to also literature that we've looked at through our academic work at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, there are a few things I want to add on to what you said also, which is really around timing. Oftentimes, policymakers demand research and evidence, today or tomorrow. And it often takes researchers, if there isn't primary evidence there already, it often takes them a lot longer to collect the information and knowledge. So that timing is also quite critical. Another thing is how you communicate that knowledge is also another key capacity that is needed. Of course, because we all speak different languages, right? The politicians and the policymakers speak a different language from the researchers. So trying to communicate with using the same language is also quite critical. So in Myanmar, it sounds like there are still limitations on research capacity, especially when it comes to policy research. So we would really like to hear from you, since you're working in Myanmar. Are there any programs for enhancing capacity in research? And if so, what does that look like, and who is either coordinating or funding them?
So because of these limitations that you have mentioned, I have also mentioned before, they are also trying to strengthen their research capacity of their staff and their targeted stakeholders, and they are conducting different research method trainings. So for example, like quantitative and qualitative research methods, ethnography, data analysis, and evidence-based policy making, both internally and externally in collaboration with international university, research institutes, and private sectors.
Thank you, Cho Zin Thet, for sharing your experience with think tanks in Myanmar. We will now move on to our next section, which is about federalism and decentralization. So the overarching question here is the following. Can we go from a military dictatorship to a federal government in a matter of 5 years? The answer is it is very complex, and the process will require definitely more than 5 years to make substantial change. Even with the strongest political will, the institutions and structures need to be in place. People's capacities need to be built, and processes need to be working efficiently.
One key reform agenda is around decentralization across 3 dimensions. We've got the political, the administrative, and the fiscal dimensions. Now, many argue that decentralization is critical for building a more accountable, more responsive, and more participatory Myanmar. And yes, we have seen the 14 state and region governments, which were established as part of the 2008 Constitution. We've seen how they've all taken on more responsibility, and they're broadening their range of activities and managing a significant portion of government expenditure.
Right. But, this process is complex, and there are many moving parts that are interdependent on each other. The 3 dimensions that Bernard mentioned earlier needs to be balanced. So decentralization, at the end of the day, should not be an end-all, be-all solution. And it's very interesting to note that, decentralization in itself may not deliver the expected benefits and results if, for example, local governments are not efficiently or effectively empowered to take on more responsibilities.
We can just look at countries in the region as case studies. So, for example, you've got Indonesia and Philippines that went through decentralization, but now they're reviewing their efforts, and there's this debate about re-centralizing certain functions again.
And in Myanmar, starting with U Thein Sein's administration in 2011-2012, the government embarked on a decentralization reform agenda.
There was a report by the Asia Foundation, which was published in October 2018, and it argued that the underlying institutions, systems, and laws governing the framework for decentralization in Myanmar have not really radically altered in the last 5 years.
But a fundamental move that the NLD government did was the following. They restructured the General Administration Department, a key structure in subnational governance. The GAD is essentially the backbone of the country's public administration system. They convene, they coordinate, and manage stakeholders at all levels of subnational governance. So, for instance, their officers are responsible for key tasks such as land administration, service delivery, and tax collection. And at the township level, the GAD Township Administrator helps coordinate amongst various union ministries, and they also head various committees. So previously, the GAD was under the military-led Ministry of Home Affairs. Now it is placed into the Ministry of the Office of the Union Government as of December 2018. This transition represents the most important public sector reform since democratic transition began in 2011 and under a NLD tenure. So this was quite a symbolic achievement for the NLD because the GAD reforms have the potential to nudge federalism from below. Nevertheless, a top-down command and decision-making culture is entrenched, where more often than not, decision-making is relayed back to the top.
But there are efforts to reform. There's been further decentralization across political, social, and fiscal dimensions since 2013. But there are still challenges that remain, and the degree of decentralization varies from one state and region to another. So let's turn back to our guest speaker, Cho Zin Thet. Cho Zin, can you share with us why decentralization and federalism is on the agenda in Myanmar?
So decentralization is an important agenda because it has far-reaching effects on many critical processes, such as the peace process, for economic development, and for deepening democracy and democratic values. For instance, discussions and progress on the peace process are no doubt intrinsically linked to a better and improved subnational governance system. So during the NLD government administration, they conducted peace conferences under the name of 21st Century Panlong Conference and Union Peace Conference, according to NCA and other organized political discussions with different stakeholders towards a federal state to achieve nation building and state building.
So, of course, there's a linkage between the Constitution and the model of federalism and decentralization. But can you kind of help us unpack this legal framework for decentralization in the Myanmar government?
So when you look at the 2008 Myanmar Constitution, there are some federalist features, and it provides the devolution of legislative and administrative powers to the 7 states and 7 regions. So this means that subnational governments have more authority and power, which is a step towards building a federal state.
I mean, I can see how this setup of subnational governments in the Constitution is a great step towards the right direction for decentralization. But I'm guessing that there's still a lot of constraints, and in practice, we're still not quite there yet.
Yes, particularly the 2008 Constitution still restricts further decentralization efforts because it does not really provide sufficient guarantees of respect for regional autonomy and local control over natural resources.
Right. And I know that there's been quite a lot of discussion by the NLD on amending the Constitution to address these constraints, which we've also seen in some of the peace negotiations as part of the Panlong Conference. But with that, I'm also, I guess, curious to hear from you on what else the current government has done to progress forward with decentralization.
So the decentralization status of the subnational governments have improved compared to the period before the 2010 general election. So each state and region established a subnational government, parliament and judiciary, as well as they have their own budget and expenditure. And also, according to the Asia Foundation report in 2018, subnational governments are increasingly involved in a broader range of activities within their respective areas, and states and region departments become more accountable to the state and region governments. And state and region local parliaments are increasingly assertive in holding the executive to account and representing. And also another thing is a township level governance system is being supported to respond to the needs of local populations. But of course, further progress is needed. And also another thing is the expenditure by subnational governments have increased significantly since fiscal year 2012-13, so which is the first time for states and regions to receive separate budgets from the union. So that is nearly 3/4, which represents a growth in their share of total government spending from around 6% in fiscal year 2012-13 to nearly 12% in fiscal year 2017-18.
That's quite positive to hear that there is progress that can be seen in the union and subnational budgetary allocation process. From the work that you've done on the ground in Myanmar, what do you see as a continuing challenge in subnational government?
So in terms of political decentralization, the 2008 Constitution has limitations with respect to free and fair elections and the appointment of chief ministers who are elected by the subnational parliaments.
Sorry, can you just clarify what you mean by free and fair elections at the subnational government level?
For example, despite the fact that Arakan National Party ANP won more than twice as many seats in Rakhine State for the 2015 election, the president appointed NLD member as chief minister of the Rakhine subnational government.
Hang on. How does that work if the ethnic party has won the majority seats at the subnational government?
That's because the president was allowed to do this due to Section 261 of the Constitution, which gives the president the power to appoint the chief minister of subnational governments. And this also implies the chief minister does not necessarily need to come from the party which occupies the majority of seats in the subnational parliament.
Okay, right. So it sounds like the union government actually still has a lot of power and determination over the subnational governments.
That's correct. All residual legislative power is in the hands of Union Parliament, although there are separations of power between the Union and subnational parliaments. So according to Section 89B of the 2008 Constitution, any legislation enacted by subnational parliaments have to conform with the Constitution and relevant Union law.
I can see how that can be quite problematic, as it effectively downplays the level of political power that the elected leaders would have in the subnational government. I did have one more final question on this, because I'm just thinking out loud here. The elected leaders in the subnational government in ethnic majority areas, right? Surely they have quite a critical role to play in the peace process, especially in conflict-afflicted areas. Wouldn't that be the case?
Well, not very exactly, because when you look at subnational legislatures and subnational governments, they are still excluded in national political dialogue and peace negotiation process, such as 21st Century Panlong Conference led by the Union government. So they cannot really participate or contribute to the federal state building process.
But I know that there is still dialogue happening at the union government level with ethnic leaders. But I guess that doesn't exactly feed down at the subnational level.
That's correct. According to our recent need assessment study, there are ethnic MPs at the union level who are involved in various committees at the Panlong Conference, but we also found out that information is rarely relayed back to other MPs at the union level, as well as those at the subnational level. And state and regional level MPs expressed that they were not directly involved nor able to contribute to the national level peace conferences, such as the 21st Century Panlong Conference.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and perspectives, Cho Zin.
It's my pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me.
So that concludes our 3-part podcast series on the Myanmar Elections Briefing. If you enjoyed this podcast, give us a thumbs up or a rating on whatever platform you listen to.
And of course, everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and go vote if you haven't already. Bye.